Hi, Andrew Cuneo here. The big news today for Arena is the announcement that there's going to be a new format called Alchemy, which is basically just going to have power level balancing for cards that are primarily in standard, but also it's going to affect historic. Overall, I think it's a great idea. I think it's something that Arena really needed to prevent formats from getting stale. I'm going to go over a bunch of the balance changes that they've announced to the cards and kind of give my thoughts about what that's going to mean for the cards and whether or not I think that it's a good balance change. So we're going to jump right in with Goldspan Dragon. They basically changed it so you don't get a treasure when it's targeted. They removed this line here. And I think that's basically going to make this card unplayable. I think 5 mana for what this does now is just not going to be good enough. You're never going to be able to like do the trick where you played it and you knew you'd be able to protect it with a 2 mana card because your opponent would have to target it, and then you could protect it with like Valorous Stance or Snakeskin Veil or anything like that. So it's going to make it so that you're just going to play it and it's going to die too often, I think. I already sort of thought that for a lot of decks, Volatile Arsonist was better even before this change, and I think this change probably just spells the end of this card, to be honest. What else we got? Auron's Epiphany. So this one, they changed it, so now the foretell cost is 7, and you only get the birds when you foretell it. You don't get the birds if you just play it from your hand. Bumping the foretell cost up to 7 means that it now costs 9 mana to do the initial combo with Galvanic Iteration, which is that's a pretty big difference. And also the nerf so that you couldn't just top deck it and play it for 7 mana and get the birds is a pretty big change as well. It's going to be a much worse top deck late in the game because the way foretell works, you can't foretell a card and cast it in the same turn. So you have to foretell it and then wait and then cast it. So that's a pretty big nerf. I think that it probably doesn't go quite far enough, to be honest. I think you're still going to see people play Epiphany decks. They're going to be worse, but they're not going to be that much worse. And I'm not going to have images of them because they didn't nerf Expressive Iteration and they didn't nerf Hullbreaker Horror. So I think you're still going to see a lot of the same red-blue shells. They're just going to be slightly worse, because Epiphany is going to be slightly worse. But I think it's still going to be one of the best decks. Omnath. This card was banned. Sorry this image is so small. These are screen caps from their stream. They changed it so it costs an extra mana, and you also don't get the comes into play trigger. You no longer draw a card, you just scry. So really big nerfs to this card. For sure. Adding a mana and also really making the initial comes into play a lot worse is a very big deal. I think this card's probably not going to be very good in standard, not only because it was nerfed so much, it was unbelievably broken when it was printed. Like, it was outrageous that it was printed the way it was. So there's definitely room for it to be substantially nerfed and still be playable, but the problem is there's no longer Fabled Passage in standard. You'd have to be pairing it with, like, Evolving Wilds. Also, there's no, what was the name of the 3-mana adventure card that went and got a land? That card no longer is in standard. There's no Cultivate in standard. So I think for standard play, this one's probably still not going to have much of an impact. This ban also, I think, is going to, or this nerf is going to lead to it being unbanned in Historic. In Historic, there's more possibilities for it for sure. Like it does combo really well with Growth Spiral and with Explore. So I think maybe in Standard you're going to see it, or maybe in Historic you're going to see it do something. But even then, the fact that it costs an extra mana and the fact that it costs, or you no longer draw a card off of it, makes it way worse. So it's probably not going to be a top tier deck. Also, just to be clear, adding 1 mana to a card that then needs you to trigger landfall multiple times is a really, really big difference, because it means that this card isn't going to function basically with like 5 land, 1 being a Fabled Passage. You now need 6 land, 1 being a Fabled Passage. Or if you don't have a Fabled Passage, you need 7 land to really to get the mana trigger out of it. So that is a really, really big change. So I think that this card is probably about what it should have been originally, which is it's kind of a fun build around me card, but it is not actually a top tier competitive card. Luminar Aspirant, they've moved when you get the counters to the instep instead of the beginning of combat, that is a massive nerf for this card. I think this card might still be playable in standard because if you want to play a white weenie deck, you don't have that many options in the 2-drop slot. You're completing with like Thalia, Intrepid Adversary, maybe one or two other things. Before the nerf, this one was just head and shoulders the best card by far. After the nerf, it is a lot worse. I kind of think they could have honestly made the change to the timing of when you got the counter and also made it a 2-1. And I think that might have been a better balancing change for it. Because at this point, I'm not, like, it might still show up, but it is so much worse. It's no longer going to be the best card in a top tier deck, that's for sure. And then this change also affects Historic, and I think in Historic, this card is just done. Hopefully, what's going to happen when they rotate the cards out of Standard is for some of these things where the nerf was just kind of excessive, they're just going to remove the nerf and just restore it to its printed version. Because this is a good card in Historic, but it's by no means an overpowered card. It was perfectly fine in its original version in Historic. So hopefully we get to see it revert back when it rotates. And maybe they'll do another pass with Alchemy and they'll buff it up a little bit more. I think making it a 2-1 would have made a lot of sense. Azikas Chariot. So this one, they cut down the number of cats you got from 2 to just 1. So essentially they're changing it from you get 8 power up front to now you only get 6 power. I honestly think this was the most overpowered card in Standard. I know that green kind of wasn't as popular as the Izzet decks. I think the reason the Izzet decks are so dominant relative to the Chariot decks is that they can kind of go over the top of the Chariot, so they match up well against the Chariot. And I think there's also just more overpowered cards in red-blue than there were in the green or like the green-red decks. Green-red decks and the green decks were a lot more fair. So I think that this was a much-needed nerf, even though it's a very large nerf to the card. And I think, honestly, this is still probably the best 4-mana card for any mid-range deck in Standard. I think it's still going to show up a lot. Maybe it'll be a little bit more appealing now to pair it with Ren and 7, which had kind of fallen out of favor because you might want to get a little bit more value out of the token copying thing. And if you're only making 1 cat the first time, your opponent's conceivably going to be able to just kill that cat. And then you're just attacking with a 4/4. You're not getting any value when you attack. So you might need to play it in a more focused tokens deck. But I thought before they nerfed this card, it was just so much better than any of the Planeswalkers in Standard. And I think it's still probably better than all of the Planeswalkers in Standard. I think this is still going to be just a dominant card. So maybe the nerf didn't even go far enough, to be honest. Moving on, Faceless Haven. They just chopped the power off of it. So instead of a 4/3, it gives you a 3/3. I think that's much more in line than the colored, or that's much more in line with the colored creatured lands, like Lair of the Hydra, stuff like that. So this was a huge payoff for playing a monocolor deck. And now I think it's going to be a real choice between playing a monocolored deck and a 2-color deck. It's going to depend on, what other synergies you're trying to take advantage of in your deck. So I think that this was a very good change. I think that they probably hit the mark perfectly. There's also some new cards coming out. Toros Disciple, which is 3/3 haste. And when it attacks, you shuffle, or you conjure 4 lightning bolts, and you shuffle them into your library. So you're, in theory, making your library better when this card attacks. I don't think this is a good card at all. Like, the kind of deck that this would go in, you're not going to tend to play long games, so you aren't really particularly likely to draw a lightning bolt. Also, this card's kind of designed under the assumption that putting lightning bolts in your deck is a good thing. That isn't going to be universally true. It's probably generally a good thing to add 4 lightning bolts to your deck, but it's pretty easy to envision game scenarios where a lightning bolt isn't a card you want to draw, so you're actually making your deck worse by doing this. Also, there's a Reckless Stormweaver or Reckless Stormseeker, whichever one the front of the card is. The 2/3 werewolf that gives something haste and a power is just a massively better card than this. So this card is not exciting to me at all. I think it might have been more interesting as like a 2/2 haste for 2, because then it would at least, it would come down earlier in the game, so you would get at least one more draw step with it. Like this thing, I mean, you might think it's going to be great. I'm going to attack twice with it, and now my deck's going to have 8 lightning bolts in it. But honestly, if your 3/3 haste for 3 is getting to attack twice, you're like very close to winning that game anyway. So I really, this is not an appealing card to me in any sense. This is another card this is a buffed card that already existed. So they added a Scry 1 to the gain 2 life. This was a pretty bad card before, and I think it remains a pretty bad card. I don't think you should put this in a deck if you're actually trying to win. In general, in Modern Magic, the cards are too efficient to play with cards that are like slow card advantage like this. You're just going to do so much better putting Expressive Iteration or Memory Deluge or Behold the Multiverse in your deck if you want a kind of 4-mana value card to prolong the game. Also, like if you're playing black, Lolth is just going to be a much better card, or the new Sorin. I don't think that this buff does anything to the playability of this card. It wasn't playable before. It's not really going to be playable after. They said on the stream that they did this because they have dated that this is one of the most popular cards to craft. And I guess the people that crafted it are going to be happy that it's a little bit better. But honestly, this just doesn't move the needle at all in terms of making this a competitive card. Kind of the same deal with Wizard class. They chopped down the level up ability from costing 5 to do level 3 to now it only costs 3. And this has no bearing whatsoever on the playability of this card. I don't really understand why they put any effort into doing this. I think the people who are playing with this card are playing with it because they like it, not because it's particularly good. And I don't really see why this minor change would make anyone like it more, so it seems kind of pointless to me. Demilich. They added a toughness to this card, which I don't think does much for it in Standard. I think it was just not well situated for Standard at all. I think this actually might make a pretty big difference in Historic, because the deck that it most often went in or tried to go in Historic was an Arclight Phoenix deck. And the Arclight Phoenix decks, especially now that they have Dragon's Rage Channeler, you kind of had a built-in vulnerability to Anger of the Gods. And buffing this toughness by 1 means that you now have a threat that you can potentially play for quite cheaply in that deck that is no longer going to die to Anger of the Gods. So if you're trying to make your deck better against Anger of the Gods, this is going to be a card that before didn't appeal to you at all, and now it makes sense for your strategy. So I think that this could actually move the needle a little bit in Historic, which is kind of cool. And that is the last of the cards that I've seen so far. Overall, excited about these changes. I don't think they nailed every tweak exactly the first time out. Hopefully there's going to be pretty frequent balance passes, and they won't be afraid to go back and, go for version 3.0 on some of these cards, because I think that there's a ton of space to keep Arena fresh and exciting by doing this, and I think it's just going to be great for the game overall. So I'm actually pretty excited about it. Thanks everybody for watching, and I hope you enjoyed the video.